Hello, this is Adam Radcliffe, and today we are going to be looking at a recent news story as my case study about an Indigenous teen who was recently sexually abused in a BC foster care home and the resulting implications and the aftermath conducted by the RCMP. So, although the news story only came out a couple months ago, the original crime actually occurred in March of 2012, and this came out in a video recording of the interrogation between the young woman who was sexually assaulted and an RCMP officer who, although should have been conducting an interview, seemingly was conducting an interrogation of sorts. So the woman came in to an RCMP office in Kelowna and claimed she had been sexually assaulted by a worker at the BC foster care home where she was currently staying at. And upon receiving this news, she was taken into an interrogation room, and the officer asked her extremely irrelevant and inappropriate questions about the assault itself. Things like if she was turned on, and of course she said no, and that she was really scared. And he basically goes on to pry at the little things of the actual attack and not so as much helping her and taking it as seriously as he should. And so now, as the video has emerged to the general public and the government is aware of what happened and the wider RCMP is aware of what happened, it has been revealed that nothing has seemed to have came out of the original claim. Um, if the attacker was punished, if the girl was moved out of the home or helped, and although this has happened and the RCMP officer who was interrogating the woman had conducted the interview extremely poorly, um, the RCMP has kept a disclosed case of how they are personally dealing with him and how he will be punished from here on out. But upon the government receiving the video, they issued a public apology which stated that no survivor of sexual assault should ever fear that their case should not be taken seriously or that they will be re-victimized in the process. And of course, they all came to that unanimous conclusion and issued that as a public statement. So moving on from the story itself, I would like to talk about how this case connects to issues with the legal process, and I'll be talking about three different points, and also reflect on how poorly this interview was conducted, how discrimination is still rampant in Canada for Indigenous people, and how even though this happened 7 years ago, proper precautions and methods should have been followed. And so first off, we have witness protection. And of course, anyone who survives an attack or any sort of traumatic event should instantly be taken into the care of the local police services. In this case, it was the RCMP. This just was simply not followed. She was obviously seeking help. She just survived an attack, a sexual attack, and was looking for somewhere safe to be after this. And instead, she was interviewed extensively, inappropriately, and her claim was just not taken seriously. And as we saw in the story, nothing was done to follow up on the attack, and she was. And next, we have legal action. So I was just talking about that, but after the claim was made to the RCMP, nothing was done to apprehend the alleged attacker and push charges on him. And that was just simply, yeah, it was just not followed. And as you can read right down there and reflected on the Bill of Rights, every victim has the right to present a victim impact statement to the appropriate authorities in the criminal justice system and to have it considered. this was just not considered. It is obvious that discrimination played a role in this officer not taking her claims seriously, and as we see 7 years later, the attacker has not been revealed. Charges were never pressed, and this guy went unpunished. And lastly, we have the RCMP and how they dealt with this situation. So, after this video was revealed to the public, the RCMP released a statement saying that they will deal with the man responsible for the interview in a disclosed case, and the way in which he will be punished will not be revealed to the public. So at this point, the man may have been fired. No actual legal action has been pursued, and he seemingly will go unpunished for his extreme mishandling of the situation and further detriment that this has caused on this young woman. So now moving on from the story itself and also how this connects to the case and problems with the legal system and how this was dealt with, I would like to talk about how there's clearly shown from my case how Indigenous discrimination in the legal system is still a major issue in Canada, and discriminatory and racist values have not been something of the past abolished with the Indian Act, but as we will focus on now, and I'm sure many people are aware of here in Canada, is the crisis of the 4,000 missing or murdered Indigenous teens, where, like my case, claims of serious offenses like rape, murder, and missing children and teens was just not taken seriously by police forces and led to many cold cases and particular offenses just not being followed through with. So how exactly does the crisis of 4,000 missing or murdered connect to my case study? Well, as you can see from the text below, from the time of 1980 to 2012, a huge figure, we're talking 4,000 Indigenous women were either found murdered or had just completely gone missing. And like my case itself, when this young Indigenous teen was claiming that she was sexually assaulted by a worker at the place she was staying at, there was no legal action pursued by the RCMP. Her claim was just not taken seriously. And as we also see in this crisis, because of the unwillingness of the police forces and government to pursue these cases, there's still a great distrust between the Indigenous communities and the legal system. And although we like to think of this thing as the past, it is simply not. And as we see in my news story, it is still ongoing and a continuing problem between Indigenous people and the legal system. And so now lastly, I'd like to talk about Canada's colonialism. And in this I'll be talking about two major events which also connect to my case, which are residential schools and the 60s scoop. Two events which we've covered in this course, but also two events that connect to my case. So, we all know residential schools, and by far the most horrific and forced cultural genocide in Canada's history, enacted on thousands of Indigenous children who were forced to practice Christian values in horrific and abusive conditions where they faced sexual abuse, physical abuse, and mental abuse on a daily basis. And although that cannot be said for many foster care homes in Canada today, in this case it's very similar to what happened to this young woman in this BC foster care home. She was sexually abused and nothing was done to help her. And secondly, we have the 60s scoop. So this was a more recent event, but is similar to residential schools and similar to my case. So in the 1960s, thousands of Indigenous children were put up for adoption and placed in white families where, similar to residential schools, they were left mentally and physically ruined for the rest of their life and were not treated the same or nearly as fair as the other white children in the family. And also, like residential schools, connects to this poor young Indigenous teen who was placed in a foster care home and faced sexual abuse and is now in detriment for the rest of her life. So now let's reflect on this case study. So I think we've come to the conclusion that this news story is not an isolated issue. Um, Things like this have happened in the past with residential schools and the 60s scoop, and things are still happening in the present. And things like this are what cause the everlasting rift between Indigenous people and the legal system. And as we saw earlier in the presentation, proper legal precautions were not followed, witness protection was not followed. The man was not prosecuted who was responsible for the attack, and the RCMP officer who was responsible for the interview was dealt with in an undisclosed fashion. Who knows what happened to him, if he was fired or if he kept working for the RCMP. And the discrimination in the legal system is still ongoing. We've seen it in missing or murdered cases and things like the residential schools and the 60s scoop. And this general distrust between Indigenous people and the legal system is totally justified. Like the missing or murdered cases, the RCMP and police forces have not taken these cases seriously, and we see this from my case itself. Nothing was done to help this woman, nothing was done to prosecute this man, and it goes to show that what happened 100 years ago in residential schools with mental and physical abuse, and what happened 50 years ago in the 60s scoop is still an obvious discriminatory and racist attitude toward Indigenous people, and until this is fixed, we will not see a different attitude and a different trust toward Canada in general and a more unified culture. So thank you for listening to my presentation today. I hope you guys are more informed and genuinely enjoyed my presentation. And yeah, have a great day.